My name is Hunter Sims, and I am the Executive Director of Financial Innovation for Impact. I'm very excited to be here with you today to mark this pivotal moment, the global launch of the Cambridge Digital Innovation and Regulation Initiative, or CDIR for short. The slowest day in the history of technology is today. And that's exactly why CDIR needs to exist, to help the world keep pace with a future that's already arriving. Innovation without guidance can create unevenness and risk, but policymaking and regulation not in sync with innovation can slow progress and lead to missed opportunities for inclusion and growth. CDIR is where those worlds meet, co-created by Brian Zhang and Siddharth Shetty, and co-convened by Agustín Carstens and Gillian Tett. CDIR is a joint initiative by Financial Innovation for Impact, a not-for-profit whose mission is to harness the power of innovation for real-world impact and transform our financial system for the better, and Networks for Humanity, a global nonprofit endeavor to provide open and interoperable digital infrastructure that enables broader access and participation in the digital economy. In true Cambridge fashion, CDIR is also a highly collaborative initiative, with the Cambridge Center for Alternative Finance, the Center for Science and Policy, the Entrepreneurship Lab at King's College, Cambridge, the Center for Resilience and Sustainable Development, and the Regulatory Knowledge Exchange, and with the support of Global Impact. During today's launch event, you will hear from the co-creators of CDIR, who will unpack what CDIR is and the objectives it seeks to achieve. We will then hear from the incoming co-convenors, as well as our special guest, Ashley Alder, Chair of the FCA, on where and how policymaking is intersecting with technology in this era of exponential change. Finally, we will outline the ways you can engage with CDIR in the months and years ahead. But prior to this, I'm honored to present the launch of CDIR with this opening video.
Every era is defined by its frontier. Ours is digital, expansive, transformative, and advancing at remarkable speed. From artificial intelligence to blockchain, profound innovations are reshaping our financial system and wider digital economy. This momentum presents both opportunity and complexity for policymakers, as an innovation delta is widening between the innovators and the regulators. Bridging this delta by enabling public authorities to innovate at pace and at scale is imperative to ensure resilience, strengthen trust, and to unlock growth. It is time to reimagine digital regulation, to re-architect innovation, and to redefine collaboration. At Cambridge, we are building a bridge to the future of regulation in an era of digital innovation, a global policy platform that brings together policymakers, academics, and market innovators to create communities, partnerships, and common solutions. From blueprint to practice, we'll share, learn, and uncover new ways to regulate, innovate, collaborate in the age of digital innovation. Introducing the Cambridge Digital Innovation and Regulation Initiative. Participate, contribute, support. Join us today.
I hope that you enjoyed watching the CDIR launch video, and it's now my great pleasure to hand the virtual mic to co-creators of the CDIR, Brian Zhang and Siddharth Shetty. Brian is a co-founder and the executive director of the Cambridge Center for Alternative Finance, and Siddharth is a co-founder of Networks for Humanity and CEO of Finternet Labs. Over to you.
Thank you, Hunter, and good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone. Let me begin with an honest admission. Siddharth and I are both, in our own ways, nerds. His version of nerdiness involves spending the last decade building market innovation platforms, digital infrastructures, and population-scale digital ecosystems, driven by a strong belief that data and financial rights are core enablers for economic opportunity. My path has been different. Over the last decade, I have worked with my brilliant colleagues at CCF5 to understand financial innovation and how it interacts with policy, regulation, and supervision. Much of our work has focused on supporting global regulators through research, training, and capacity building. We met 18 months ago at the BS Innovation Summit in Basel, and it quickly became clear that we were asking the same question from different angles. How can digital regulation and public sector innovation keep pace with the speed, scale, and transnational nature of the digital innovation in the marketplace, and how we can approach this at a system level? And yes, the CDIR branding probably confirms that we are indeed nerds. When we first saw CDIR in command line format, we recognized something special and meaningful in it, a way of listing the root directory of the financial system, making the invisible visible so we can better understand it and then reimagine how we regulate, innovate, and collaborate.
Thank you, Brian. Yes, CDIR stands for the Cambridge Digital Innovation and Regulation Initiative. It is our way of seeing, through research, data, and evidence, the current landscape of digital innovation and the global state of regulation and digital governance. CDIR brings together policymakers, regulators, innovators, and academics to examine the defining issues of our new era, and also to surface opportunities and confront emerging challenges. But dialogue alone is not enough. Our aim is to build a platform for action too, to foster communities, forge public-private partnerships, and co-develop common solutions. To convene at this scale requires exceptional leadership. Individuals who can bring together multiple stakeholders, steer complex conversations, and help us imagine what comes next. Brian and I are immensely grateful to have two such remarkable figures, Agustín Carstens and Gillian Tett, as a part of our incoming co-conveners. We will have the opportunity to hear directly from them during the panel discussion.
Now, please allow me to briefly explain why we created CDIR. Digital innovation is advancing at a pace and scale we have not seen before. Technologies are diffusing rapidly, and sectors such as finance are being reshaped by new actors, activities, assets, and new digital architectures. This transformation brings enormous potential for growth and inclusion, but it also poses profound challenges for digital regulation. Innovation today is exponential. Large language models are upgraded within months. New products and services emerge daily. Agentic transactions can take place autonomously and instantly. And business models are increasingly modular, composable, and borderless. Regulation, by contrast, remains largely linear, defined by sectorial mandates, jurisdictional borders, and policy-making cycles that can take months or years. Even with advancement in regulatory innovation and the wider adoption of supervisory technology, structural gaps persist. An innovation delta between the innovators and regulators is widening. If we want to unleash the potential of digital innovation while protecting consumers and markets, we need to think collectively about how to narrow this innovation delta. That could mean shared resources, peer learning, and co-developing common solutions. It also means elevating the perspectives of emerging markets and developing economies. Many jurisdictions in the global south have pioneered digital innovation, from mobile money and digital payments to climate tech. And we seek to bring those insights to the center. And across the core pillars of digital regulation, policy making, licensing, supervision, and enforcement, we can create more effective mechanisms and models for collaboration across sectors and borders. Finally, in a shifting geopolitical landscape, an independent, academically anchored initiative matters more than ever. CDIR is designed as a trusted, neutral space for dialogue, experimentation, and collaboration that is global in reach, yet firmly anchored in Cambridge. And that brings me to the three mutually reinforcing dimensions of CDIR. First, we are reimagining digital policy and regulation for a world where technologies, digital platforms, and cross-sectoral intermediations are reshaping how markets function. Second, we're catalyzing policy, regulatory, and supervisory innovation by building a digital regulatory commons, where authorities can learn from each other, experiment safely, and co-develop practical and scalable solutions and protocols that are applicable for multiple agencies and jurisdictions with the help of public-private partnerships. And third, we wish to facilitate cross-regulatory and cross-border collaboration through research, capacity building, and regional coordination. Our work programs focus on frontier and cross-cutting issues, from digital infrastructure and inclusion, financial health, data sharing frameworks, critical third parties, tokenization, and AI governance, quantum, and cyber risks.
Thank you, Brian. And let me introduce the key programmatic pillars of this initiative. This is where CDIR becomes real, where issues become crystallized, collaborations are forged, and inspirational ideas become implementable reality. First, CDIR will host a virtual global policy dialogue series convening the world's regulators around the same digital table and discussing pertinent policy and regulatory issues that will shape our digital markets, digital economies, and our collective digital future. We will also organize regional regulatory symposia. These are in-person convenings focusing on regional challenges and opportunities in emerging market and developing economies. Co-hosted with a regional anchoring institution, each CDIR regional symposium will be action-oriented, bringing in regulators as well as innovators, and thus cultivating a regional community of practice and innovation. The Cambridge Visiting Regulator Fellowship Program is a one-week, highly curated residential program for senior regulator leaders designed to provide a structured environment for collective inquiry, peer learning, and collaborations in innovation. At Cambridge, visiting fellows will take part in seminars, roundtables, working sessions, and policy boot camps with academic and industry leaders, and work to develop cutting-edge, scalable, and implementable regulatory innovation propositions. And lastly, the Digital Commons Innovation Hackathon is where we put theory into practice, bringing policymakers, regulators, young entrepreneurs, and seasoned innovators from cross sectors to pressure test these innovative concepts and develop common solutions that don't just benefit one public authority or one jurisdiction, but all stakeholders in our digital commons. And lastly, to wrap up, our flagship invitation-only annual conference and dinner that will be hosted at King's College, Cambridge. The day will combine structured sessions tackling defining policy issues and co-create the blueprint for our digital futures. We will also release a limited number of seats for everyone to apply. CDIR would not be possible without the amazing support and collaboration from our partners. At today's launch, we very much appreciate the support from the Cambridge Center for Alternative Finance on empirical research and data-led insights, the Center for Science and Policy for co-hosting the Cambridge Visiting Regulator Fellowship, the Center for Resilience and Sustainable Development for their partnership on the Policy Bootcamp, the Entrepreneurship Lab at King's College for their partnership on the hackathon and the opportunity to engage with the community of student entrepreneurs, and the Regulatory Knowledge Exchange, a digital regulatory community platform hosting more than 3,000 central bankers and financial regulators from over 250 public authorities around the world. We will look to create more such partnerships with various stakeholders, so please get in touch with us.
Thank you. And CDIR also seeks to catalyze dialogue and deepen collaboration across the truly global, cross-regulatory, and cross-border community. We are therefore profoundly grateful to our CDIR thematic anchors, who support the two co-convenors and help steer our thematic policy discussions. They bring not only deep domain expertise, but also lived experiences as a former senior policymakers and regulators from Kenya to Malaysia, Ghana to Canada, Dubai to Brazil, who have made consequential decisions and supported regulatory innovation within both financial and non-financial authorities. We very much look forward to working with them in the months and years ahead. Our sincere thanks to Brian, Francis, Tim, Daniel, Christine, Weimin, Elsie, and Marcelo for their leadership and support to CDIR. It also gives me great pleasure to announce that in the new year, we will establish a CDIR Advisory Council to help amplify our impact and scale our work. We are deeply honored that Sir John Aston, Vice Chancellor for Research at the University of Cambridge, whose leadership has consistently strengthened the bridge between academia and public policy, and Nanda Nalekani, philanthropist, pioneer of digital public infrastructure, and co-founder and chairman of Infosys, have agreed to serve as co-chair of this council. Please stay tuned for more advancement and programming from CDIR in 2026. On that note, let me hand over the virtual mic back to Hunter. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian and Siddharth, for providing us with this vision for CDIR and its core components. It's now an honor to transition to an esteemed panel joining today to provide us with their thoughts on the insights around this dynamic convergence of technology and policy and regulation. We're so pleased to have with us today Dr. Agustín Carstens, the incoming co-convener of CDIR, who served as the general manager of the Bank for International Settlements from December 2017 to June 2025. Under Agustín's leadership, the BIS launched the BIS Innovation Hubs to promote modernization and innovation in central banking. He also served as governor of the Bank of Mexico and deputy managing director of the International Monetary Fund. Thank you very much for joining us today, Agustín. Additionally, based in Cambridge, but joining us from New York today, is Dr. Gillian Tett, OBE, the Provost of King's College, Cambridge, and a member of the editorial board of the Financial Times. Her work covering the 2008 financial crisis received extensive media and policy attention from its prescient coverage of the financial instruments that led to the financial crisis. Many thanks for being with us early in your morning. Finally, we're also very thrilled to be joined by Ashley Alder, the chair of the UK Financial Conduct Authority, who also served as the chair of the IOSCO, the International Organization of Securities Commission, from 2016 to 2022, and the chief executive officer of the Hong Kong Securities and Futures Commission. Thank you very much for joining us today, Ashley. Brian and Siddharth will be facilitating the panel discussion. Over to you.
Thank you very much. Good morning to you, Agustín. My first question goes to you. The rise of AI agents, tokenized assets, and alternative financing channels and instruments and systems appear to signal a profound paradigm shift in how markets are structured and operate. How can policymakers and regulators keep pace and innovate to remain effective, seizing opportunities while managing risks? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Brian, for this question. And more than anything, let me start by congratulating you and Siddharth and everybody who has collaborated behind putting resources, putting ideas, making this a reality. Is a huge, big step forward. And I'm very pleased to be associated with this major effort to bridge the gap between the regulators' capacity and what is going on in the field of innovation. Let me start just by reminding something that for most of you is quite obvious, but nevertheless, I think it's important to remind us about this fact. I mean, why in financial transactions, financial systems, and discussions in these fields, we emphasize so much about regulation? And well, we know that when different firms, individuals are handling other people's money, it's very important to preserve trust. If trust is lacking, different types of adjustments in portfolios, in lending practices, and so on, go on. People can withdraw their resources, and that can have huge social impact. We know that financial crises are really have the potential of affecting very, very deeply for many generations the development of a country and obviously the finances of the individuals. So it's a major political and social issue, and therefore we need to make everything that is at our hands for the financial system to be as well regulated as possible. Now, this doesn't mean that there is a trade-off between innovation and regulation. I think that's the paradigm we need to, or that idea is the one we need to defeat. I think both innovation should be able to happen in the context of appropriate regulation, and I think that is what should characterize the work of the CDIR. Now, to tackle the very concrete challenges we face today, we have to also realize the following. I mean, for many decades, even we could say even centuries, we from the regulatory point of view were used to a world where almost nothing happened without the authorization of authorities. Regulated financial institutions would come, present us our ideas. We managed to give them some feedback, and out of this interaction, regulation would come along. But things were sort of under control, and we could sort of keep this parallelism between innovation and regulation. But technology has broken that. Right now, even without going into illegal fields, many financial transactions can take place. Many financial practices can change of nature without the need of necessarily without the guidance and the appropriate regulation in place. This, together with the fact that the regulators traditionally are not in the field of innovation, has generated this huge gap. So what do we need to raise this gap? First, I think it's very important that authorities have a much better visibility, visibility of what is going out there. I mean, that is it's something that there is a lot of efforts going on, a lot of technological applications that are being implemented, or many without the knowledge or timely knowledge of authorities, so that they even themselves can be brought up to speed. The other important aspect is, let me be very frank, financial resources and capabilities. I mean, if you add all what is being invested individually, part of major firms like the big techs, and so on and so forth, and you compare to how much the public sector is capable of investing in raising its infrastructure, the gap is huge. So this means that to solve this, we need to have a much better visibility of what is going on in the field of technology. Second, by collaboration and by initiatives like the CDIR, to really make up for the gap in resources. The good thing is that now the technology travels very fast, and practices that are followed in one country now are followed in many, pretty much at the same time. I mean, in the past we were used of a sequence of financial innovation would take place in advanced economies, and then it would trickle down to developing countries or emerging markets. Now, innovation can happen everywhere at the same time. So there is really a huge potential of sharing knowledge and closing the gap. Finally, let me say that technology itself, intelligent application of technology, can also help us bridge the gap. For example, tokenization, which for me is a major driving force, can really facilitate a lot regulation and supervision if we use the technology, if regulatory aspects are introduced inside the tokens, and that conditions some of the transactions, that would be great. And of course, this would facilitate tremendously the supervision. So visibility, collaboration, smart use of technology, for me, is the key for success.
Thank you very much, Agustín. Can I turn to Ashley? Good afternoon to you. From the perspective of a market conduct regulator, what are some pertinent issues that the FCA is contending with amid the advancement of AI?
Thanks, Brian. Well, picking up on your opening remarks, I think I classify myself as a rather orthodox regulator who is probably not a nerd and is probably quite linear. So from that perspective, I could be an ideal sort of crash test dummy for the whole project. But more seriously, I'll just touch on, well, three phrases actually, one of which is, and you'll be familiar with this, Brian, because Brian sits on our board at the FCA. One phrase is tech neutral, i.e. To what extent should regulators be agnostic on technology and just concentrate on the rules and standards in place in a rather orthodox way? The second phrase is tech positive. That's obviously leaning far more into the topic, which much on the basis that Agustín has covered. And the third, which I think is incredibly important, is the regulatory perimeter. So in relation to taking those in turn, and this is all around, and the example really I'm going to dig into very briefly is supervision of AI in regulated firms. And the in regulated firms is a really important aspect of this because that defines our perimeter, i.e. what we are able to regulate as a body based in statute. So tech neutral, basically, we of course understand that in particular AI models are constantly upgrading and evolving in a matter of a few months. So an attempt to create specific rules for AI in a traditional approach doesn't really work at all. So the way in which we've described our approach to responsibility in firms to a regulator is, again, fairly orthodox. We've basically talked about the outcomes we expect, and we've identified standards, broad standards, which apply to much activity, not just tech, within firms that then locate where responsibility lies. So in the UK, we have something called the senior managers regime, which basically is around the responsibility of individuals within firms. That was a post-crisis development. We have an overarching set of expectations under the heading of consumer duty. That's to do with outcomes for consumers in the retail space, and of course, operational resilience across the piece. And that's based really on the idea that it is the regulated firm's responsibility to react, and for us to react to those firms when things go wrong. Hopefully they don't, but they do normally. That's tech neutral. It lies now, something we are spending a huge amount of time pursuing, lies under the heading of tech positive. And that, it can sort of be seen to be lying in tension with tech neutral, as it were. But actually it really isn't, because it's a development which flows from the realization that it is very, very difficult to make conventional rules for AI in this space. And to supervise against them. So that basically boils down to working with tech partners and working with firms to, in real time, develop, assess, and deploy safe and responsible AI, or at least enable firms to develop and assess, deploy safe and responsible AI. That's leaning in fairly heavily into a sort of partnership model. And we have a number of, in fact, we have so many initiatives, I'm not able to list them because I can never memorize them. However, two which are very current is something called AI live testing, which is what it would imply, which is working with firms in relation to particular use cases for AI. And then something a little bit more experimental, a bit more early stage, which is called which is one of our sandboxes around that, which have been going for about 10 years now, but they're being kind of retooled around this. Part of this is to do with the fact that firms, notwithstanding the availability of technology, sometimes are quite nervous about deploying it unless they've had a conversation with the regulator, because it is so novel and because it is so high impact, whether it's in the retail space or otherwise. So we work with firms around those the principles of explainability, fairness, model bias, etc. But what that does not result in a certificate of compliance, as it were, because then we sort of revert to tech neutral as an approach to establish where responsibility lies for this. So but I think in future, I suspect that particularly with this initiative, which is launching today, they will kind of move at some point to a very different way of supervising. And it's something, I've actually stolen this from an email exchange that I had with Brian yesterday, which, and the phrase he used was embedded computational toolkits or protocols as distinct from conventional rules and standards to interact with technology within finance. And one sort of example of this, it's a slightly different area, but I think we've got lessons to learn from it. International standard setting, for example, we'll come on to this, is a bit clunky, not least because you have to establish an international consensus to do it. But in the world of rather boring but incredibly important world of financial markets messaging, ISO 20022 and fixed protocols are examples of protocols which are heavily adopted, but do not actually sit within the conventional regulatory system. And they're basically about the how-to of financial markets messaging. Now, it's not the same topic, but again, I think there is something to be dug into there, as a lesson said. I could say a lot more. I mentioned perimeter. Simple point there is that our perimeter fundamentally does not extend to big tech. And that in itself is an issue. There's a little bit of an inroad into that in the UK, where we are extending our reach directly to so-called critical third parties, which will mainly be cloud companies in relation to their systemic relevance or their relevance to systemic risks across the financial system. And that's partial, but nevertheless, there is a broad topic around regulatory remits and our perimeter, and which only extends to regulated firms. It does not extend to big tech, but we can pick up on that later. Thanks, Brian.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ashley, for that overview. And Gillian, I have a question for you about trust. Trust has always been the foundation of finance, and safeguarding it the core mandate of regulators. But in a digital environment that's shaped by AI, social media, and disintermediation, how is the notion of trust evolving, and how might this reshape the roles and responsibilities of financial service providers and public authorities?
Well, thank you very much indeed. And let me start by saying that, like the others, I'm absolutely delighted to be joining this very important initiative. King's College, as many of you know, was a home of John Maynard Keynes, who really demonstrated the power of bringing academic insights into the world of finance and money into policymaking in a practical way. It's also the home of people like Alan Turing and Jeff Hinton, and a number of social scientists like Edmund Leach as well. So we're very excited about the idea of actually trying to bring these different strands together and look at the critical world of money through the lens of technology, and I should say social science too. For those of you who don't know, I actually trained initially as a cultural anthropologist and am very interested in how humans and human society interact and change with and in the world of cyberspace. And one of the themes that I've been working a lot with in recent years as a kind of academic sideline is how humans are responding to the question of trust in the digital age. Trust in finance is critical. I mean, the roots of the word credit, as in credit markets, come from the Latin credere, meaning to believe or trust. And as we know, or rather as we saw in 2008, when you lose credit in the Latin sense, finance is worth absolutely naught. However, I would argue that there's a really important shift in trust that's going on today, which really matters for what's happening in finance. When I was trained as a cultural anthropologist, we were taught there were two axes of trust. You had small face-to-face communities which relied on horizontal or peer group trust, what you might call eyeball to eyeball trust, that knitted groups together. But as groups became very big, you couldn't rely on that anymore because you didn't have geographical proximity. And so you had vertical trust, trust in institutions, leaders, bureaucracies, rules, and things like that. And that was the axis that existed, or the two axes of trust before the 21st century. Today, what our cell phones have done is create the potential for massive horizontal-based trust, what we call distributed trust, on a vast scale, which is basically trust between people who never actually eyeball each other and who may not even know each other in terms of their real identities online. Now, that is becoming increasingly dominant because when people say today trust in institutions is collapsing, and all the polling suggests that is indeed the case, what they actually often mean is that trust is migrating away from institutional-based trust and trust in leaders into trust into the peer group online. That impacts many aspects of our world, our consumer choices. We no longer rely on experts like travel agents or restaurant guides to tell us where to go and eat. We're more likely to actually ask the crowd online with peer ratings. It impacts how we move around the world. You know, we used to assume it was impossible to get into a stranger's car without trust. Now we trust something like Airbnb, which has an oversight surveillance system. It affects our politics. And it also affects finance because in many ways, a digital asset is an asset in many cases, not always, which relies on peer-to-peer trust in a horizontal platform, as opposed to fiat currency, which is institutional and hierarchical. Now, markets on one level have always had an aspect of vertical trust, institutional trust. They can't function without that. But what's really fascinating to me right now is as the digital asset world takes off and these two worlds come together, how will we actually ensure that trust is credible going forward? How do we actually maintain credit in the Latin sense in the digital assets world? What does that mean for regulators who have worked in a world where basically vertical trust has been dominant for much of their life? And frankly, journalists who often worked on the world where vertical trust and experts has been dominant. And how can we actually both draw the extraordinarily exciting, liberating benefits of that, but also safeguard against all the dangers? And as you've heard earlier, reverse innovation may very well be key. And I'll stop with this by saying two things. Firstly, M-Pesa was reshaping African finance long before the West woke up and thought it had discovered it. And it did so with horizontal trust networks. I was recently meeting with a group of activists, humanitarian workers in Sudan. We hosted a big event for them in Kings, who were saying that the way they're distributing whatever aid gets across into Sudan right now is actually through horizontal networks, through WhatsApp, and through payment systems which are based on horizontal trust platforms. And they've almost given up on the old hierarchical vertical model. So this, to me, is one critical way to look at it as we go forward for this really interesting project.
Thank you so much, Gillian, for that overview. And now to Agustín. From your experience, how have public-private partnerships fostered responsible innovation, and how do they enhance trust?
Well, that's a great question, in particular, following from the brilliant commentary from Gillian. I always learn from Gillian, no matter where I find her. I think a key aspect here is the fact that all the parties involved in financial transactions in the financial system have to realize that a more collaborative approach is what really is needed. I mean, we need to make sure about one thing, and people should know this very clearly, and that is that technology doesn't change the risks in financial transactions. Therefore, the issue is how can we collaboratively and collectively deal much better with these risks? Yes, I mean, oftentimes regulation, supervision help in the way how these risks are being managed. But sometimes, the instances are not there or the technological possibilities are not there. So you might do some financial transactions without the oversight of the authorities, but that doesn't mean that the risk has disappeared. I mean, what this has disappeared is just the eyes that are looking or are looking on top of what you're doing, but the risks are still there, and for sure the risk will materialize at some point, and that's very costly for the individuals and for society. So for society in general. I think the openness from the innovators would be important. To get closer to the authorities would be important. Now, of course, the authorities also need to give something. And I would say that in a very concrete way, I think where we can make much better progress, faster progress, that would be very useful for the innovative process. It's just to be able to provide a much better framework for innovation. I mean, again, this aspect of us lagging behind in some aspects make innovation difficult, because an innovator might say, well, I want to play by the book, I want to play by the rules, but where are the rules? Where can I read how tokenization should be implemented? What are the concepts of a tokenized assets that should be included? Which is the authority who will regulate any dispute? This means that we need to provide that. We need to get a taxonomy of concepts. We need to provide broad principles, in particular, even more now that this is a global aspect, and therefore we need necessarily to look beyond national frontiers. And we also need to provide legal frameworks. This would be useful no matter how innovation takes place. So openness, closeness of the innovators towards authority, facilitate early exposure of what is going on to authorities, and then for authorities respond very quickly with better taxonomies, better principles, clearer principles, legal frameworks, and so on, so that innovators also know on top of what infrastructure they can start building and progressing.
Thank you very much, Agustín. Can I just turn back to Ashley and pick up this point you mentioned about regulatory parameters, right? As we know, digital markets cut across domains of finance, data, competition, communications, and digital infrastructure is increasingly horizontal. Yet our regulatory system is still largely confined by industry verticals. The UK's Digital Regulatory Cooperation Forum, or the DRCF, is one notable endeavor to bridge this. And from your perspective, how important is cross-regulatory collaboration, and what more is needed to govern genuinely cross-cutting digital markets? Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I think this goes back to the point that Gillian was making about the horizontal versus vertical approach, and the traditional vertical approach and the horizontal approach, or the horizontal sort of phenomena around all facets, different facets of technology. The DCRF, what it does is amalgamate the conduct regulator, the communications regulator, the competition regulator, and the data privacy regulator, so that they're able to better speak with one voice around the horizontal, which I think is really important. It does help innovators navigate different rule books and enables those rule books to be aligned so far as possible. So, for example, if we if we impose an obligation on financial firms to identify vulnerable consumers, how does that interact with privacy rules when digital tools are used to do that? So, that's an example of the sort of cooperation which is at a practical level. But I do actually just want to come back to the point that Gillian raised about trust, and an example of that in our world. We are rolling out something which we see as being incredibly important, which is a new form of financial advice to retail, to consumers, which is deliberately mass market, and which is a kind of hybrid of traditional personalized advice and more broader guidance. And it's part of a broader project to stimulate investment demand in the UK, essentially. At the same time, if you look at the statistics that have come from various sources about how many people, their first port of call for financial advice is large language models. And the significance of that is a large language model, whichever you use, isn't actually designed to provide financial advice, but yet it still does it. And associated with that, given the style with which large language models can communicate with you, is that question of either real or artificial trust, or possibly even misplaced trust in the result that you get. And the reason I'm drawing attention to this, it's really important because, again, that's a horizontal, without any doubt, but with what feels like an individual interaction. And potentially it conflicts what we're attempting to do from a relatively traditional approach, which is a form of regulated advice, which incidentally will include a big technological component using AI tools, etc., within it. But nevertheless, it's somewhat traditionally based, as distinct from the intuitive, easy step that anyone can make to use ChatGPT, which by definition is not regulated itself because it is not designed to produce financial advice. It's just one example of that. So that's one dimension. And the other dimension I mentioned earlier on, which you referred to, even though we are able to cooperate horizontally across relevant regulators in the UK, that doesn't really get into the broader point of overall reach. It kind of it alters, so it's different as between the regulators to where the reach sits. But for example, just one example, social media platforms as an origin of financial crime and scams is something that also is a growing phenomenon. And again, it's incredibly difficult to deal with that in the traditional way as a regulator. In other words, we don't have the sort of point of contact or the anchor, as it were, into that sector to enable to operate effectively. But I'll leave it there, Brian. Thanks.
Thank you, Ashley. Can I turn to Gillian, just building on this theme of horizontal and vertical, right, which is fascinating. In one of your Financial Times article 4 years ago, you articulated the challenge of people in the tower trying to regulate square, like flat, interconnected networks. 4 years on, do you think the challenge to reconcile that structural misfit is getting better or getting worse?
Well, what I'd say is the tower and the square was actually not my metaphor. It was actually Neil Ferguson, the financial historian's metaphor, who pointed out that Italian ancient sort of, medieval cities tended to have both towers and squares, and power oscillated between the tower, which is a vertical form of trust and authority, and the square, which is basically the crowd. So that's the pattern that we've looked at in the past. And trying to have the tower regulate the square is tough. It's not entirely new because in many ways markets have always existed on some and always run on some level of lateral face-to-face trust patterns, which authorities did not control and dictate. I mean, the very nature of a financial market is crowdsourcing what a price of something should be. But the issue that makes this doubly tricky at the moment, which I think both Agustín and Ashley have touched on, is the question of silos. And my second to last book was called The Silo Effect, because I passionately believe that the financial crisis arose partly because of silos in regulation and the mental map that financiers used around finance. Most notably back then, you had silos between trading risk and credit risk. I won't go into the details right now, but the subprime mortgage crisis basically partly emerged because products fell between different buckets and could not be easily classified or monitored either by regulators or by the bankers themselves in terms of their own risk management departments. The same thing's happening today, but this time the great gulf is between digital regulation and digital innovation and finance and money, because the type of people who traditionally looked at finance and money, generally speaking, weren't the computer nerds. They were economists and finance experts, and vice versa. And when one starts talking about the regulatory perimeter, as Ashley did, it's not just a question of what do banking and finance regulators have the right to regulate today, but also do they have the skills and the mental maps for that? And I'll just finish by making one point, which Agustín has made quite a few times, is that if you look at the question, say, of cloud computing and the extreme concentration of exposures to a very small group of cloud computing platforms, which lie, for the most part, traditionally outside the regulatory perimeter in the banking sphere, how are you going to regulate those in the future? I mean, that's one area where vertical and horizontal platforms matter, and where we really need to take a fresh approach to regulation and how we imagine finance, and where, to cite Ashley again, reverse innovation is going to be critical, because if you are a country that's creating greenfield regulatory structures right now, it's much easier than a place where you're dealing with a central bank that's been around for several hundred years and has marble pillars, which are meant to give an impression of solidity and permanence and credibility, but also signal an unchanging, stuck in the mud kind of approach to life.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Gillian. And to follow up on that and the broader theme of trust, a question I have for you is about geopolitics and geoeconomic dynamics. From AI governance to data regimes and digital currencies, these are increasingly influenced by geopolitical effects on the digital markets. How do you think these forces are shaping or constraining regulatory thinking and strategic choices?
Well, the way that I understand the world today is through 3 points. Firstly, that we've moved into a sphere of geoeconomic and geofinancial policymaking, where big countries are trying to use economic tools and financial tools for political dominance and political conflict, or rather political rivalry. Geoeconomics was last seen on a large scale back in the 1930s, when economists like Albert Hirschman analysed it brilliantly. It went totally out of fashion post-World War II, but it's back again now. The second point to make is that within this geoeconomic framework, China currently has geoeconomic power by virtue of having control of key supply chain nodes. America has geoeconomic power, hegemonic power, by virtue of having the dollar as a reserve currency and controlling key financial nodes. And I think tech hegemony today is genuinely still being contested, or rather digital hegemony. So you have a battle between US and China around digital hegemony. And the third point, because I know we haven't got much time, is that this leaves other countries both vulnerable, but also with potential tools to protect themselves against some of that vulnerability. Because the priority for any countries that is not a dominant hegemon, which means not US or China today, is to, one, recognize the situation clearly in their vulnerability, and recognize the way that both America and China are using networks to try and extend viral control. Two, to think very clearly about nodes and reliance and make sure they hedge those nodes and try and become self-reliant in some ways. And then three, above all else, to create alliances with other countries which are not US and China, where you basically need to have ways of protecting yourself through safety in numbers. And in many ways, that is where we are today. And I'm not criticizing either the US or China in terms of what they're doing. I'm simply trying to describe the reality as it is. And so at a time of rapid technological change, where tech hegemony or hegemonic power is still being contested and may never be won by anybody, we may be moving into a very fragmented world. Countries, regulators need to very urgently find ways of looking at the nodes, looking at their dependencies, and creating alliances with each other, simply to ensure that they have a seat at the table going forward.
Thank you, Gillian. I think the really question is, in this world of fragmentation, can we still have a meaningful collaboration? On that note, can I just ask Ashley?
I think we have to have a meaningful collaboration.
Yes.
It's more important than ever.
Exactly. And to that point, Ashley, so cross-border collaboration among the regulators has been happening for many, many years, many decades, right? So in this new environment, how can meaningful international and regional cooperation happen, and what should be prioritized?
Yeah, well, I think as I mentioned earlier on, and I know time's short, so I'll just keep it very brief. I think the standards, international standard setting bodies like the one I used to chair, IOSCO, so I think they might be a little bit too slow in the way in which they operate to really get on top of this, which is why I think quite a few regulators are participating in alternative, more agile networks, such as GFIN, which is broad and has a large membership. And I think the significance of GFIN is that a lot of it is about developing techniques rather than rules or standards, not least because it's incredibly difficult to get a consensus around new rules and standards in the current geopolitical environment, without any doubt, at an international level. So, you know, there are other sort of bilateral or smaller multilateral engagements, such as the US-UK transatlantic task force that was announced after President Trump's visit not long ago to the UK, something called Project Guardian with Singapore and others, including the FCA, which is about asset tokenization, and there are more. But I think that's probably the direction in which we're able to get more bang for our buck internationally and on a horizontal cooperative level. I'm not ruling out the big sort of, you know, the international standard setting bodies themselves, but I think possibly we need to have a bit of a faster run at this along the lines I described before it gets to the stage of rules and standards. And the final thing I'd say is that I did mention this earlier on. I just do wonder whether we're now at an inflection point where the traditional approach to rules and standards in any event as to how we supervise this area is becoming a little bit outmoded.
Thank you, Ashley.
Thank you, Ashley. Agustín, you've been at the forefront of leading thinking on digital innovation, and recently you argued for a system-level redesign of the financial architecture, one that is interoperable, programmable, scalable, and accessible to all. What would a regulatory system built for this future look like? And what do you feel are the capabilities that must be developed now for us to get there?
Well, I echo a lot of what Ashley just said. I mean, I think that the financial system is taking a huge leap into the future, changing dramatically its composition, its way of interacting, the way it interoperates, and so on and so forth. I think that we need to also do a leapfrogging from a regulatory point of view. To start with, we also need to change our mindset. The mindset should be, let's see how can we conduct this, or more than anything, be part of it in a responsible way, rather than be lagging behind all the time. I also think that what I mentioned first, which is the need for the public sector to invest more in breaching these capabilities. Again, I think we always talk about in which areas the government are not investing. I think in an area where there is tremendous underinvesting is here. I think that we could get a lot of bang for the bucks that are needed, and it certainly would facilitate having a platform that will save many headaches for future generations, because something that will happen is that accidents will happen, you know. So if we can prevent many of these accidents, the return, social return of whatever public money is invested in this pursuit would have a tremendous impact. And it's very elementary. I mean, just to have the adequate technology in the regulatory side. I mean, the other thing is that we have regulators, we have supervisors, but how many of them are technologically savvy? I mean, do we have the capacities to interpret algorithms, to assess what the potential of AI is, and so on and so forth? There is a big gap there. So I think public investment is fine. And again, and here I close with this. Given that public resources are not readily available all the time, collaborative efforts and economies of scale at the global and regional level is of the essence. We need to work together, because the problems are very similar. Again, several of us have mentioned the fact that innovation can take place as easy in a sub-Saharan African country that in a major financial center in the world.
Thank you, Agustín. I'm aware of time, and here's the last question to our entire panel. In one sentence, what's the one thing you want the CDIR to accomplish in its first year? Can we please go to Gillian, Ashley, and finally, Agustín. Gillian, please.
Break down silos and recognize that reverse innovation is not just about new products, but about new regulatory approaches as well.
Thank you. Ashley?
Yeah, pretty much the same thing, really. So we get a much better understanding of the direction we should go in, which is a development of conventional rules and standards around technology, AI, distributed ledger, etc., and/or embedded computational toolkits or protocols, which is a very, very different approach and is much far more horizontal than the former.
Thank you, Ashley. Agustín, please.
Make regulation fun. I think that
oh dear.
I think we are in one of the few opportunities where going into regulation could be fun, because the field is really, really challenging, and it can really wake passions. I think it can be a fun journey.
Fantastic.
We want to see you wearing sneakers and a black turtleneck, Agustín.
Absolutely. Next time.
Thank you so much, all of you. Can I hand it over back to Hunter?
Thank you all. And if that's not a way to end the panel, I'm not sure if there is a way to end the panel. Please join me in thanking our esteemed panelists for this insightful and stimulating panel discussion, and we look forward to many, many more opportunities to leverage CDIR as a global convening platform to discuss policy and regulation issues relating to the development of our digital markets, economy, and future. And for those of you looking to understand how to engage with CDIR, we will be launching invitations to contribute to a number of programmatic elements of CDIR in the coming days and weeks. I've seen the chat has also been quite live. There will be the Global Dialogue series and a regional symposia. And if you are a senior financial or non-financial regulator working on the intersection of digital innovation and digital regulation, you are also welcome to apply to become a Cambridge Regulator Visiting Fellow in due course. And you can contribute to our forthcoming innovation hackathons and apply for a limited number of places to attend our annual conference and dinner. We already have high-level information about these key CDIR programs on our website, so please do take a look and express your interest in engaging with us and support on this initiative. The website should be in the chat, and please follow along via our LinkedIn page as well. Thank you again for our speakers, as well as to all of you, this global audience, for this important initiative. We appreciate your time, and we look forward to engaging with you. And finally, for those who have not yet registered, today is also the kickoff of the Soup Tech Week, which is a flagship event from the Cambridge Soup Tech Lab in collaboration with the World Economic Forum. Please do register. The link should be in the chat, which is kicking off now, where the State of Soup Tech 2025 is beginning. Thank you all, and have a great remainder of your days.